In a forgotten corner of an abandoned mansion, a single portrait sat shrouded in dust, its colors dimmed by decades of neglect. At first, it seemed nothing more than a mother and her young son frozen in time, a snapshot of gentility from the year 1900. But the moment historians decided to enlarge it, a chill ran through the room. The more they examined the painting, the more it resisted ordinary understanding. The mother's eyes, once soft and distant, seemed to follow them with a quiet intensity. And the boy's smile warped under the scrutiny, revealing hints of anguish no brush should capture. Faint lines etched into the shadows of the background emerged as if the painter had hidden a secret. Cryptic, urgent, almost alive, whispers ran through the gallery as the details multiplied with every magnification, impossible textures, impossible depth, and an uncanny sense that the figures themselves were aware of being observed. By the time the last historian leaned in, speech caught in his throat. A horrifying clarity settled over them all. This was no ordinary portrait. Something unnatural lingered in the paint, something that seemed to stretch beyond the canvas, beyond history itself, as if the room itself had been holding its breath for over a century, waiting for someone to notice. It began with an ordinary call from a local historian, the kind of routine request that promised nothing more than cataloging some forgotten artifacts in an old mansion on the outskirts of town. The building had been abandoned for decades, its windows darkened by grime, its walls streaked with the yellowed fingerprints of time. Vines crept through shattered panes, curling along staircases where dust lay thick as snowfall. Most people avoided it, murmuring about the family who had vanished under mysterious circumstances, leaving behind nothing but rumors and faded memories. Yet something about the mansion had always drawn the curious. Those who felt compelled to peer beyond the decay and into the remnants of a past that refused to stay silent. The portrait was discovered in a small, neglected room on the second floor. A chamber frozen in an eerie stillness, where time seemed to have halted in the hush of dust motes dancing in dim light. It hung crookedly on the wall, its frame chipped and worn, the glass coated in decades of grime so thick that the image beneath was almost imperceptible. At first glance, it appeared mundane. A simple rendering of a mother and her young son, their expressions polite and restrained, the kind of genteel composure that 1900s portraiture demanded. There were no signs of grandeur, no overt hint of wealth or status. Just a family captured in the careful, deliberate brushstrokes of an artist whose name was long forgotten. But even in that first moment, there was a sense of unease that the historians could not explain, an instinctive recognition that something about the painting was out of place. Perhaps it was the unnatural symmetry of the mother's hands, folded too precisely in her lap, or the boy's eyes, slightly too reflective for oil on canvas, glinting with a light that seemed to come from within rather than from the room. Or perhaps it was simply the quietness of the room itself, how the air seemed heavier in that corner, as if the mansion had exhaled only when the portrait was discovered. Every historian in the room felt it, the tension that threaded through the air, a subtle warning that this object, so easily overlooked, would demand far more than cursory attention. The initial photographs, taken quickly and without much thought, revealed little, but the whispers among the team hinted that they had stumbled upon something remarkable. The portrait, innocuous as it seemed, had survived untouched for more than a century, shielding secrets that the building itself seemed desperate to conceal. And the moment it was fully revealed, there would be no turning back from the questions it raised. Once the portrait was carefully transported to the archive, historians debated how best to study it without damaging the fragile canvas. The decision was made to enlarge it digitally, to examine every brushstroke, every detail hidden in the shadows, under light that could reveal nuances invisible to the naked eye. At first, the enlargement seemed innocuous, merely a technical step, a routine exercise in archival diligence. But as the image grew on the massive monitor, the room shifted. A palpable tension replaced casual curiosity. Colors that had once seemed muted deepened into strange vibrancy, and textures emerged that no ordinary paint could produce. The mother's eyes, already unnerving in their stillness, seemed to take on a luminous quality, reflecting light in ways that made them appear almost wet, almost sentient. The boy's expression, previously polite and conventional, began to betray something else, a subtle tightness around the mouth, a flicker in the gaze, as if he were aware of being observed, as if the digital magnification had somehow awakened him from his century-long slumber. Historians leaned closer, their breaths held unconsciously, drawn into a gravity they could neither name nor resist. And then they noticed the edges of the canvas, previously dismissed as background, beginning to shift under scrutiny. Tiny shapes, nearly invisible at normal size, resolved into patterns and lines that hinted at meaning. Symbols, letters, or scratches, none of them officially part of the artist's style, seemed to twist and curl in the shadows, forming shapes that teased at a message meant only for those who looked long enough to see it. The air in the archive grew heavier with each click and zoom, as if the very act of enlarging the portrait was disturbing a long-held equilibrium. Questions began to echo silently in the room. Had the painter hidden something deliberately, a secret only visible under magnification, or had the centuries themselves somehow warped the image into something more than art? One historian, whose hand shook slightly as he zoomed closer, whispered that the details felt alive, as though the figures were resisting the scrutiny, reshaping themselves. With every pass of the lens, shadows deepened unnaturally, brushstrokes rippled in ways impossible for oil on canvas, and the very texture of the paint seemed to suggest depth beyond the flatness of the wall. Every second the enlarged image remained on the screen. The room's air thickened with unease, and the team realized that what had begun as a simple archival procedure had opened a door to something unexplainable, a detail that, once seen, could never be unseen, a hidden world encoded in oil and pigment that defied the logic of time and history. As the historians continued to scrutinize the enlarged portrait, the first thing that drew their attention was the mother's eyes. At normal size, they had seemed calm, almost comforting, yet now, under magnification, they radiated an intensity that defied human comprehension. The pupils, unnaturally dark and precise, seemed to track the movements of everyone in the room. Some historians blinked rapidly, certain that their minds were playing tricks, but the sensation persisted no matter where they moved. The mother's gaze followed them with a subtle but undeniable focus, as if she were weighing their very presence, evaluating their intentions. The boy, sitting stiffly by her side, underwent a transformation that was even more unsettling. What had once been a polite, serene smile now hinted at a tension that the brushstrokes should not have captured. A slight curl of the lips suggested a secret unearthed too early, and the angles of his eyes conveyed an intelligence and awareness far beyond the innocence one would expect of a child in 1900. It was as though the digital enlargement had peeled away a veneer, exposing the hidden consciousness within the canvas. The historians began to notice subtler shifts as well. The mother's hands, folded in her lap, seemed to adjust imperceptibly, depending on the angle from which they were viewed. Shadows twisting around her fingers in ways that contradicted the source of light in the room. The boy's posture, once stiff, now appeared to fluctuate under scrutiny, suggesting a life of movement frozen mid-action, caught in a moment that should have been eternal yet somehow remained alive. Whispers filled the room, low murmurs of disbelief and fear, as if speaking too loudly might provoke the figures on the screen. One historian, leaning in closer than the rest, felt a cold prickle along his spine when he realized that the expressions were not static. They were interactive, changing ever so slightly as he adjusted the zoom or tilted his head, a subtle mimicry of his own reactions. The more they studied the enlarged image, the more impossible it became to reconcile with reality. These were not just painted faces, they were actors performing in a medium that should have been permanent, frozen, inert. And yet, the evidence was undeniable. The figures were communicating, reacting, watching. The air grew thick, heavy with tension, as the team began to understand that the portrait's power did not lie merely in its historical value, but in the unnerving vitality of its subjects, whose eyes, smiles, and gestures carried secrets that the passage of time had been unable to conceal. Secrets that no historian could ignore without consequence, secrets that seemed to reach beyond the canvas, beyond logic, beyond comprehension itself. The more the historians examined the portrait, the more the room seemed to close in on them, a pressure that was almost tactile, as if the very walls were aware of their scrutiny. What had initially appeared as random shadows and cracks in the background began to reveal patterns. Faint inscriptions, tiny marks almost imperceptible without extreme magnification. At first, they thought it was a trick of the light or the texture of the aged canvas, but as they enhanced the digital image, the marks became unmistakably deliberate. Letters, numbers, and symbols emerged, intertwined with the folds of drapery, etched into the background, as if the painter had hidden a secret for those willing to look closely enough to find it. Some symbols resembled archaic script, others seemed like crude sketches, almost runic, curling into shapes that suggested more than mere decoration. A sudden unease gripped the historians. It was not just the presence of these marks, but the way they appeared to be arranged, as though conveying a message designed to unsettle, to warn, or to reveal something long buried. The mother's eyes, magnified already to an unnatural intensity, seemed to draw attention to these details, her gaze subtly angling toward the corners, where the inscriptions were most concentrated. The boy's expression mirrored the growing tension in the room, his subtle frown now seeming to acknowledge the markings, as if aware that the observers were uncovering something they should not see. Attempts to translate or decipher the symbols only deepened the mystery. Patterns overlapped, letters faded into lines, and meaning seemed to shift depending on the angle of observation. One historian noticed that what looked like a simple swirl from one perspective formed a word, when the canvas was viewed at a slight tilt. Another remarked that the numbers, when rearranged, resembled dates that coincided with known tragedies in the family's history. Though the logic behind it was maddeningly elusive, there was a sense that the painter had encoded a story of sorrow, of warning, or perhaps of guilt into the very layers of the painting, a hidden chronicle that could only be perceived by someone who dared to look beyond the surface. The team grew silent, each of them caught between fascination and fear, unsure whether they were witnesses to genius, madness, or something far older than either. It became clear that the portrait was not merely a historical artifact. It was a conduit, a message preserved for over a century, waiting for the right eyes to uncover its meaning, and the act of reading, it seemed to draw them closer into its orbit, binding them to the secrets it had guarded with such obsessive care. Secrets that might have remained buried forever if not for the enlargement that had awakened the subtle, haunting voice of the past. By the time the historians had traced every line, every hidden mark, every flicker in the enlarged portrait, a heavy silence had settled over the archive. The air felt charged, as if every breath they drew was being measured and mirrored by the figures on the screen. They had spent hours uncovering anomalies, subtle expressions that shifted, eyes that seemed alive, inscriptions that hinted at forbidden knowledge. But the final revelation struck them not with sudden violence, but with a creeping, suffocating clarity. The portrait, they realized, was not merely a work of art. It was a record of something that defied the logic of history, a document not of paint and canvas but of presence, a lingering consciousness frozen yet active across time. The mother and her son were not simply figures rendered by brushstrokes. They were observers, participants, perhaps even witnesses to events that had never been meant to survive in visual form. Every historian in the room felt it simultaneously, a shared recognition that their careful, rational minds could not fully grasp. The enlarged image was more than a picture. It seemed to pulse with an awareness, as though the act of examining it had activated some dormant force, encoded in every detail. Shadows deepened unnaturally around the figures. Light shifted in ways inconsistent with the room, and even the textures of the paint seemed to move subtly under their scrutiny. One historian's hand froze over the mouse as he noticed a faint outline in the background that, at first, had appeared to be an accidental smear, but now revealed the form of another presence. Indistinct, blurred, yet undeniably there. The realization that the painting might be recording something beyond the knowledge of anyone present left them paralyzed. Conversation ceased, breaths became shallow, and all eyes returned instinctively to the mother's gaze, where patience and warning seemed interwoven. The boy's expression, no longer simply unsettling, now carried a weight of knowledge, a silent insistence that they were trespassing in a space not meant for the living. It was impossible to determine if the anomaly was supernatural, a clever trick of the painter, or some convergence of both, but its effect was absolute. It erased certainty, leaving only awe and fear in its place. The historians understood, with a clarity that chilled them to the bone, that the portrait had preserved something that history itself had tried to forget, a fragment of existence impervious to time, and that the act of enlarging it had shattered the boundary between observer and subject. What they were witnessing was no longer a painting, no longer a historical artifact. It was a living echo of a past that refused to remain silent, and in that echo, every rational explanation faltered as the full, incomprehensible truth pressed against their minds, leaving them speechless and profoundly unsettled in a way that would linger far beyond the walls of the archive. Understood, we've fully explored all 5 key points and built the spine, chilling narrative around the portrait. If you want later, I can also polish the entire introduction into a single flowing story, tightening suspense and pacing so it reads like a cinematic thriller opening.